hope people have been able to fortify themselves in the 30-minute break. The item that is now up before us is the time of use congestion charging methodology and next steps. I think, Jenny, are you going to be doing the introductions? Sure. We've got a team presenting to us, so we'll hear the presentation, take the questions, and then go into debate. Over to you, Jenny.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Nā koutou katoa. Nice to be here this afternoon. So this is a conversation about time of use charging. We're not calling it congestion charging anymore, I think we're calling it time of use charging. You'll recall we had a workshop with you in August when we took you through the congestion question work, which was done in 2020, which had a really good look at what this could be and do for Auckland. And from that workshop, you confirmed that it was a priority for you to get this up and running, and you asked us to come back to you with some thinking about an implementation methodology and an implementation timeframe. So that's what the team has got for you today to put on the table for you to have a look at. We're going to just quickly go through with Michael and Tracy the time of use charging and what it is, just so we can all get back on the same page. Outline the previous work that we've done, and then Tracy will take you through the methodology we've been designing, what that looks like, and then open up for a conversation about where you want to go with that. So hopefully that will help this afternoon. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Kia ora. Michael Roth, Lead Transport Advisor for Auckland Council. So we'll start with some scene setting. There has been a strong emphasis in the long-term plan and in the broader processes that we need to make the most of our existing network before we go and spend a lot of money on building major projects. So this program is really focused on making the most of our existing network. We also have major public transport improvements in play with City Rail Link in particular, but Eastern Busway. We've seen the Northwestern Busway network improvements just roll out now. These will enable the city centre to work much better for public transport in the future. We also know at the moment other cities are interested in where we are heading. Examples are Wellington and Tauranga, who are also looking at road pricing related initiatives. And it is very important for our city to continue to grow, that we implement demand management as well as revenue generation. Otherwise, our transport system will continue to decline. So just very briefly, time of use charging. That is a photo from Singapore, who have implemented this scheme for many decades. It is a fee to use parts of the road network. It can be focused around the city centre, or it can be focused on specific roads like the inner city motorways. The idea of charging different prices for different times is to reduce the amount of congestion and to spread the demand across the network more. So higher prices would be charged during the peak hours in the morning or afternoon. This reduces congestion by spreading the demand. It enables drivers to change their journey time, change their route, change their destination, or change their mode of travel. So there are many ways people can change their behaviour to avoid having to pay the charge. Why is it needed? There has been quite a debate around. Everyone knows Auckland has a high level of congestion, around or in excess of $1 billion per annum. That impedes our economy, and that will only get worse in the future if we do not address it. And we have the well-known problem of induced demand, where if you build more roads, you encourage more people into cars and you encourage existing drivers to drive further. So any congestion relief is very short-term. So building our way out of this is nigh on impossible. It is too expensive and it does not really solve the problem. So we need to manage demand. This has been a process long underway. The Auckland Transport Alignment Project in 2016 already considered it, so that's already 7 years ago. There are many existing council strategies and government strategies on transport that really require a demand management tool like time of use charging to deliver a more efficient and more economically productive transport system. We also know that the regional fuel tax is under threat. With the loss of that revenue, Council has a real problem in working out how to fund the improvements that we need to cater for growth. Congestion charging prior to the election had broad cross-party support from all sides, so there's an expectation that that will continue now that a government will hopefully form very soon. We also know that most of the stakeholders in the space are quite supportive of congestion charging or time of use charging if it is designed well, all the way from Helen Clark Foundation that has a focus more on the equity side to organisations like New Zealand Initiative, Te Waihanga, the Infrastructure Commission and Infrastructure New Zealand that are focused more on the economic productivity issues. A lot of work was done years ago under the branding of the congestion question. All that work is available on public websites. It showed that in the order of a 10% reduction across the city was possible depending on the design of the scheme, and many people could experience that in the sense that it would take the level of congestion down to school holiday travel in many areas, which is actually quite a relief. The most recent formal position from the government was from the Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee inquiry. They made unanimous recommendations, so cross-party support, and it was really about progressing the development of this scheme. They have to provide enabling legislation to allow us to do it, and it's clear that we have to do public engagement and we have to properly deal with issues such as equity to maintain support from the public and from stakeholders. And an important part of that is using any revenue that we gain from this process to invest back into a better transport system. So just as a bit of a starter, we would be looking to focus on the city centre area and in the city motorways. None of this design has been completed yet. We will talk about that shortly. But these are the critical links that are congested and also provide people with an opportunity for changes. The city centre is the core of our public transport network, and we are improving that network. So that's where more people have an opportunity to change. So that's where we can actually drive a lot of congestion relief in all the approaches toward the city centre. And the motorways are quite congested, flows break down quite early in the morning and stay broken down for a long time during the day. This is a real problem because the motorway's capacity actually reduces once the flows break down. So if we can maintain those proper flows through those motorways using a time of use charging system, we can dramatically reduce congestion and allow the motorways to actually carry more traffic than they currently carry. So I'll now hand over to Tracy to go through the detailed methodology.
Kia ora, I'm Tracy Burkhan, Group Manager for Services and Performance at Auckland Transport and most recently caretaker of the congestion charging program. We, as a result of the joint workshop we had, put together a program that I'll take as read in these slides, in this report and slide pack. Oops, where are we? Can I get you to drive that for me? I've turned it off now. Sorry about that. But the important thing to note about the program is that it builds on a considerable body of work that was already done by the congestion question, the 5 agencies that got together to do that piece of work, and looks to work in an optimal way to progress the finalisation of a scheme in line with enabling legislation. The program presented in the report aims to reduce rework, so we're not going to redo things that the congestion question covered, but it'll be about where we update it, where we bring new data, look at new findings and recognise that there are dependencies in a particular order that we should work through implementing a scheme. So essentially workstream 1 goes back to the scheme purpose and objectives, revalidates those. Workstream 2 runs all the way through the program, which starts to deal with public and stakeholder engagement. We look at the physical scheme design in work streams 3 and 4, including the functional specifications. And Workstream 5 builds up the governance and ownership of this. We are committed to it being a joint Auckland Transport, Auckland Council programme of work, but we'll also look to introduce into those governance forums political forum and feedback loop and cross-agency support with Waka Kotahi. Workstream 6 deals with procurement and starts to look at what we have to do to physically implement a scheme. Next one, Michael, thank you. And Workstream 7 starts to deal with some of those equity mitigations that Michael referred to earlier. That you wrap all of those next sort of 3 up together, where we look at the revenue policy, complementary policies and initiatives that council needs to think about to support and enable time of use pricing and customers' privacy, etc. Legislation is the other big dependency, so we can do a certain amount of this work prior to understanding what the legislation actually enables and permits, but we'll be working closely, I think, with this government on timing for that, and obviously this council plays a huge part in advocating to central government to get that legislation out of the bottom drawer and get it in front of the House so that we can move quickly. Then Workstream 12 just produces that final implementation and procurement plan. So the timeline, or indicative timeline, sees us actually starting now. So that's I suppose, one of the main messages today is we need to start this now in order to be able to deliver a scheme that coincides with those major improvements in public transport that are delivered through the CRL, but also to start to address some of the funding issues for alternatives for people when regional fuel tax, if regional fuel tax is repealed, and we need to keep our city moving. So essentially, that was sort of all we had for you today. We've got 2 recommendations that this group endorses the creation of a joint Auckland Transport, Auckland Council program team to progress time of use charging now as of November, and that we will come back to you every step along the way and work through the details of the scheme and its design. Thank you.
All right, thanks for the presentation. We'll open up to questions now. Councillor Walker.
Like a number of other councillors, I received a submission on the part of the National Council of Women Auckland branch, and they raised a number of issues. In no particular order, the impact of time of use charging on disabled people who often are not in a position to use public transport. In particular, the impact on women who proportionally are often in lower paid jobs and do not have the flexibility to adjust their times. Often these people, the National Council of Women pointed out, are also caregivers. So these are the people that are dropping children off to school because sometimes public transport doesn't avail themselves to get them to school. And I could list off a number of other issues. So the concern that I put to you is that public transport simply does not deliver, and in that respect, just as an aside, they also mentioned mana whenua groups. They're disproportionately advantaged. So how are we going to deal with that? Because this is a penalty, and it's a blunt penalty.
Thank you for the question, Councillor. Equity will be a critical part of the detailed design of this scheme, because those are very fundamental issues to address. There are a lot of people with mobility impairments. In some cases, that means they can't take public transport. So we need to look at discount or exemption categories for people who do not have that capability to take an alternative form of transport. Those design issues need to be gone through, and that is part of the detailed process that we have proposed. It's also why we are talking about a focus around the inner city area and the city centre in particular. The city centre of Auckland already has about 55% of all trips on public transport or active modes during the morning peak hour. Now, that's obviously very high compared with the rest of Auckland, but it's actually very low compared to comparable cities. Brisbane, for example, has 70% on public transport. Sydney, more like 80%, London, more like 90%. So, and we know we are improving our public transport system, particularly with CRL, but also Eastern Busway and other initiatives. This will allow public transport to shoulder a lot more of that burden of trip movements into the city centre. The city centre attracts people from all over the city, so many of them are longer trips. They have a congestion impact across those motorways to the north, south and west. So by reducing the amount of car trips that are driving all the way from the outer areas into the city centre and getting those people onto public transport earlier in their journey, we are reducing congestion broadly, and we're doing that without impeding people very much, because public transport access to the city centre will be able to handle those flows.
I think through you, Chair, just to add to that, yeah, there's absolutely no doubt that there's going to be impacts on a wide range of people across the city. And one of the work streams you saw under work stream 7 has got to have a look at a lot of those impacts, all of the impacts, and understand how the mitigations are going to work and what that's going to look like. Completely understand and accept that. I think if you go up a level though, those of you who were in the VKT workshop yesterday can really see that this type of behaviour kind of management or congestion pricing alongside road pricing, alongside other things, is a really critical part of managing our network going forward for the next 10, 15, 20 years for Auckland. It's a critical component of the VKT thinking, so it's, but it's acknowledged it is a huge change.
The other question I've got, Mr. Chair, goes around the alternative or the alternatives. Effectively what you're proposing is a penalty, and the assumption is that the penalty will drive change. Having said that, we know through consumer behaviour and human psychology that incentives work far, far, far better. So to what extent have you already been engaged in a whole variety of incentives? For example, travel planning for businesses and the like. How advanced is that? Incentives around working from home, which has taken off, appropriate technology for people so that they could do it. A whole range, there's a vast list of incentive-based options. T2, T3 lanes, they form part of that. That I would have expected would have been a precursor to this.
We already do have a lot of incentives in our transport system. Incentives through public transport subsidies, for example. So the issue we've got in Auckland is we have lots of incentives, but we don't really have any disincentives other than congestion. So we're providing a poor level of service for those who are driving because there's no disincentive there. So by providing that small cost component, we do encourage some people out of the traffic flow, which means everyone else who remains in the traffic flow does benefit. There are a lot of people who will appreciate the faster travel times, and even more importantly, the more reliable travel times that will result if we can reduce congestion. So yes, in one sense, this is a bit of a disincentive, but it does also allow us to provide more incentives by reinvesting the revenue that we gain from it into better transport services, which would be better public transport, better active transport connections, and potentially even more subsidies, discounts or exemptions for certain groups of people for whom this does create some problems.
And my last question, Mr. Chair, is you mentioned the focus on a couple of locations, Lincoln Road, for example, Te Atatu, the motorway. Will it not be the case that all you'll do is actually extend the peak? So people will just shift out. So instead of the peak being from, say, 6:30, 7 o'clock to maybe 9 o'clock, we're just going to extend the peak. You'll have the effect of induced traffic. which you're well familiar with. So instead of reliability, you'll have reliability, but reliability of being caught up in congestion over a longer period of time. Will that not be the case? Because it's what I'm increasingly experiencing now. The peak is widening, it's getting worse.
Yeah. So through you, Chair, I think that latter question is going to have to be looked at in the scheme design when we look at where and how in the city, and that's part of this implementation program. But I just want to make a comment that the congestion pricing has got to be seen in a much wider suite of interventions across the whole of the city. It's not just congestion pricing and nothing else. Auckland Transport's already doing a lot in the PT growth space. We do a lot of travel management planning. And again, the VKT workshop you sat through yesterday showed you a whole range of different things that are going to have to come together, congestion pricing being one part of that, to really shift how Aucklanders use their transport system going forward. So it's really important we keep congestion pricing in context of a huge range of things that we're already doing as an organisation and a council together, but also that we will be doing going forward.
And in the context of extending the peak, in one sense, yes, that's the case. But the issue around the peak is the flow breakdown. The goal of a traffic management system is to avoid flow breakdown. So if we can manage the number of cars on the motorway network so that they do not have to slow down and accelerate, slow down and accelerate, we actually increase the motorway network. A road line that is running smoothly on a motorway can handle about 2,000 cars per hour. Whereas once the traffic flow breaks down and they stop-start, that drops by 10, 15, 20%. So that means for the rest of the time, the motorway network is operating much less optimally. So if we can pull people forward, get them to do their trips earlier or a bit later, then we may be extending the peak a little bit, but we're avoiding flow breakdown, so people will not have a negative experience during their travel. And the change in trip timing is only one way people can change. They can also change their route, their destination, and of course their mode of travel. So a lot of people will make changes other than retiming their trip. There will be those others also who choose not to make a trip and work from home instead, for instance. So there are many other changes.
Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. I guess the questions that I would have posed have already been put by Councillor Walker on the importance of coming to grips with equity on this. But you've confirmed to us already that these are a series of recommendations that have been on the boil, if you like, since, you know, I know I sat on the board of Auckland Transport in 2010, and in one way or another, we have been working towards this for a long time. So just as I'm sure for those who travelled along the side of the southern motorway and used to look at the rail corridors unused, that there was a resource that we weren't using. In some ways, we've all been looking at the roads and saying, how can we use them better? I want to know, from the research that you have undertaken with London, where congestion charging has been in place for a long time, and other cities, how they have specifically addressed the equity issues, because these are not to be ignored. And the second part of my question relates to my fear that people just see the council as revenue gathering all the time. Everything we do is about revenue gathering. And yet there is another story to be told about the enormous pressure, the mental health pressure and everything else that's associated with pressure on business and with ongoing congestion and the inability that we have to just keep building more motorways. So those two questions are really important to me. What specific initiatives have you seen that have been successful in the countries that you have looked at in addressing equity? And secondly, if you could just shift the dial from talking about revenue generating to replace the regional fuel tax, and I'm taking it as an assumption that this would not be in addition to the regional fuel tax. What are the other benefits that you can give us on this?
Thank you for the question, Councillor. In terms of equity, as you're aware, I recently visited Stockholm, London, Singapore and Oslo, all of whom have similar schemes in place. What they have done is essentially focus the scheme on the city centre area. That's the primary issue, because the city centre area has much higher income levels than the outer urban areas. So you're targeting the initiative at the high income area, not the low income area. And also the city centre area has the best range of alternatives, so more people have opportunities to not choose to drive. So that's how they've generally addressed the main issues, but they've also implemented a range of discounts and exemptions. And as we discussed briefly before, those with mobility impairments often receive exemptions, so they are allowed to drive in the area.
Sorry to interrupt, but can you talk while you're explaining that about how they are delivered, these exemptions? Because I think people don't realise the ways in which they can get practical assistance, otherwise it's just words.
Yes.
Can you talk about the specifics?
Yeah. A time of use charging scheme would operate very much like a road tolling scheme in terms of the back end. It would recognise the licence plate on the vehicle and then charge that vehicle the appropriate fee based on where and when it is driven somewhere, just like a road toll. If a person has an exemption, their licence plate would have that exemption recorded so that they would not be charged that fee. So people could apply, people with mobility parking permits, for instance, could apply for exemption and be granted that. That's the usual way that these schemes will then not charge people who have an exemption. There are also sometimes boundary issues around the edge of a scheme where certain people get discounts or get a certain period of cheap travel. That can be arranged in the back end of the system and associated with their vehicle's licence plate. So the people will then never see the charge. The system will automatically include that.
So, using the recent research that you've undertaken, how do they get around the exemptions for people in an emergency type situation, for medical, there are a range of people for whom they can't choose when they travel. How have they dealt with that in other cities?
Emergency vehicles will generally be exempted, so that they will not have to pay to start with, so ambulances, fire police and the like. Also, there will be a process of customer engagement. So if there is a very real issue where a person has had no choice to travel and normally they would have been charged, but they feel they have exceptional circumstances, there would be a method where they could write in and record that, and that could be considered. That's generally how those one-off circumstances are dealt with in these schemes.
I appreciate that, Your Worship, but I'm just responding to the questions that have been posed to me that have been quite legitimately put with people's concerns over this proposal. And in some ways, I really welcome the fact that we're having a discussion about this. It's long overdue, but there are concerns and we must, I think, as elected representatives, be able to respond to these.
I think sorry through you, Chair, the design phase is going to have to address a lot of this stuff as well, so there's going to be much more opportunity to talk this through as the design phase continues on. But absolutely it's important. I agree with you, Councillor. Do you want to talk about the additional benefits?
Yes, the second part of your question is also very relevant, and in fact a lot of the cities that you just referred to had much better public acceptance when they didn't talk about revenue and when they spoke about the other benefits that are associated with the scheme. So we saw on one of Michael's earlier slides that $1 billion productivity hole that congestion makes for Auckland. That's a 2017 figure, so it's probably considerably higher than that. I was very interested to hear some of the media yesterday, where I know some of the media were concerned about tradespeople and things like that driving through the cordon, and I think the Mayor's answer was absolutely right, that if a tradesperson can get to 8 jobs a day instead of 5 because they're not sitting in traffic for hours, that's going to mean that the city is better off as a whole. And also we have looked at the idea of a daily cap, so if that tradie is crossing the cordon 7 times, they won't necessarily be charged 7 times, they'll likely only be charged twice. It goes even to freight, where a lot of us do online shopping. Our parcels sit in trucks, in the motorways, spewing out emissions in traffic jams. I worked very closely with the zero emission truck trial that we had in the city, and a lot of those trucks have to come through the city centre to deliver to different parts of the city. So those are going to be benefits. Emissions reduction is also a collateral benefit of reducing congestion. So there are a raft of things that we can highlight when we engage with people to take away that, as you say, that contention that it's all about revenue.
I wonder why, as officers, in the recommendations, you were not putting forward those vexed issues around equity and so forth, that these are the very specific things that a reference group will be charged with delivering upon. I think to give comfort to those who are worried about this proposal, that's a very specific directive that needs to be addressed before this can progress further.
Understood.
Councillor Henderson.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got a couple of cues. And thanks for your hard work on this over such a long time. Please don't take this as anything other than my ward have got in touch with me a lot in the last 24 hours and have several questions. I'll try and represent them as best I can. Okay, so are we contemplating replacing the regional fuel tax with this as the revenue stream, or would we be looking at raising revenue over and above the RFT to compensate communities that might be affected by the charge?
It's actually not this project that's suggesting removing regional fuel tax. I believe that's going to be a central government conversation. So the work that's been done to date has not linked it to regional fuel tax in any way, but I know that the outgoing government, the last government, had suggested it might be in addition to regional fuel tax, and my understanding is that the incoming government believe that it should replace it, or it should be a different revenue stream, and regional fuel tax should no longer be.
Thank you very much. And I suppose this is what the feedback process itself is for, but do we have any initial insight on how popular this is with the public as a piece of work?
So when the Select Committee report was published, the Select Committee did public consultation on this, and it was quite interesting because the statistics are quite telling. Apparently 70% of businesses that engaged in the consultation with the Select Committee process were in favour, but 70% of individuals were not in favour. So you've got quite a polar sort of opposite for the only formal consultation that's been done to date. Again, that was a long time ago. That was those report findings, I think, were published in 2021, and the consultation was prior to that. So we may have been in a little bit of a different situation. Part of that work stream too, which is the public engagement and consultation work stream, will get a much closer litmus test on where we're at now in the city.
And through you, Chair, just to add to that, you may recall some earlier slides from Michael where it really showed how this is introduced into the public arena and when it's going to be absolutely critical for people's uptake. Because at the start, people go, oh yes, great. And then as soon as they realise what it means for them, you know, we change in terms of a cycle of acceptance. So that public engagement work stream is fundamental to how this is pitched and how this is landed with our people. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And acknowledging that there'll be work to come on the equity questions as well, so I can save those ones. Just 2 more quickly, Chair. Given the history of how our city has been planned, such that the poorer communities are in suburban areas, not in the centre. Are you concerned that there are communities that are going to be disproportionately impacted by the charging regime?
Thank you for the question, Councillor. Again, this is the detailed design focus is to put the major burden in those areas that are not so disadvantaged. You see that initially from our focus on the inner city area, but that also goes to many of the details that we still have to design, including the discounts and exemptions.
Thank you. And my last question's for the chair, who's just standing up. Do I wait? Sorry, Chair, I picked the exact moment when you were standing up. I've just got a question for you. Just in terms of D, I note that in that reasonably exhaustive list for a political reference group, no one from South or West Auckland is in there.
Yeah, we
got some concerns.
You know, I think, Councillor Henderson, that's the product of the positions as opposed to trying to get geographic representation. We did discuss that at the time, but the group is driven by those positions essentially, which have dictated a number of the delegations, to be honest. I certainly, I don't want to say what the interests are, but certainly Councillor Fletcher, for instance, has quite a significant interest in the south, and I would and certainly. Certainly the ward councillor for Franklin would perhaps be suggesting that too. So I think we can accommodate that geographical diversity, and I'm certainly happy, given our ward goes right over to very bordering yours, to pick up anything from the west. Otherwise it does start to get very numerous.
So I merely point out that the poorer communities are most likely to be the ones that are more heavily impacted and will have a big interest in this work.
Yes.
And to be honest, I don't see their representation. I just invite you to maybe have a think about how that works. But yeah, I take your point.
Yeah. And that is a very good point. Okay, we have quite a lineup of people now. We have IMSB member Brown, councillors Ferry, Turner, Sayers, Lee, Newman, Darby, Bartley. It's going to be a long day, folks. Over to you, member Brown.
Awesome, in that order. Okay, some of the challenges have been mentioned. I guess just when you start turning theory into reality, and human behaviour can sometimes be at the heart of that. If I think about the 4-litre diesel ute driver who goes another way during the same time and actually increases emissions, even the tradie going from 5 to 8 jobs will increase emissions, so you're sort of moving things around as opposed to maybe mitigating them. I guess whenever I see these things, it's always a positive spin, but I'd just probably like to know, and some of these things have been touched on, as you went through this robust analysis, and I'm sure you had many technical experts contribute, what downsides and challenges did you identify in this initial work, noting that some of them have already been discussed? And the reason I ask this is because my challenge to any group that are trying to get something across the line is to be very transparent about the benefits and the challenges, as opposed to championing one and not the other. And I think it's quite hard for us all to tease them out. I'd actually rather you did it, and then we can make an informed decision. So back to the start, just other things that haven't been mentioned that you've identified already, that will be quite challenging.
Thank you for the question, Member Brown. I'll address the first part of the question around the tradie who goes to 8 jobs instead of 5. That does not increase emissions, because those 8 jobs exist regardless of whether that one tradie can do them or whether someone else needs to do them. So that is a good demonstration of the economic productivity benefits that a scheme like this enables by removing all that time delay out of the network. So it does not increase emissions, it actually decreases emissions by reducing congestion and improves our economy in that process.
There have been some really interesting curly parts to this, as you say, that in practice manifest when you move into implementing a scheme. It's already been mentioned today, I think, that a number of the vehicles in the city are unregistered and unwarranted, and many of them are used by disadvantaged parts of society because they must get to either work, education or medical appointments. And you often have a situation where an extended family uses one of those unsafe or unregistered or unwarranted vehicles. Quite often that causes quite a lot of problems in an equity sense where those people do not have another choice. I think the design of where the scheme is and how the exemptions are administered starts to mitigate some of those things. There was talk in the original research of linking it to the Green Card or a community services initiative, much like the buses were going to do, in the respect that then that takes care of some of the lower socio-economic sectors of society that don't have a choice. There is also a fraud issue where people deliberately obscure number plates if we're using automatic number plate recognition, so we have to work through that. There is also a scenario where if you are granted an exemption, then your grandmother, their cousins and everybody else drives that vehicle when they have the opportunity because it has an exemption, and that may not be for the person that exemption was included. All of those things have been dealt with in international schemes, and we would just have to work through what they look like in a New Zealand environment. It's quite analogous to public transport fare evasion, where you put a scheme in Singapore and everybody pays their fare, and you put a scheme in New Zealand and some people don't pay their fare. So all of that has come to light in the work that's been done to date, and it'll be carried forward into these new work streams to tease out. But again, it's worth including those in some of the public engagement so that people know we've considered these things and we're not just shooting from the hip here.
And I think just to add one more, the challenge, one of the bigger challenges obviously is going to be acceptance by our people and our communities. It's a really big change for us. And New Zealand hasn't got a scheme like this in place, but we do know that Tauranga and Wellington are also looking, so we can draw on some of their expertise and thinking and how they've handled and learned things as we go along the way. So, you know, it's a real step change for New Zealand, this one, but Auckland's got the opportunity to lead that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and again, it's that challenge and noting that, you know, you've alluded to that just in the answer. It just makes decision making a lot easier when they're presented to you, as opposed to it being a combative sort of element that you need to work through. But thank you for that.
Councillor Ferry.
Thanks very much, and just signal colleagues that Councillor Fletcher and I were heading in a similar direction on a possible amendment to be around including some specific wording around equity, which I believe is sitting with the chair, so hopefully that'll come up. I was quite interested in the NCW-NZ submission, which I actually played a hand in writing back in the day before I wore this hat, and noting their in-principle support for congestion charging, but the outstanding issues around equity, which many of my colleagues have been bringing up, and I've been quite encouraged by the answers. What I'd like to know, encouraged by the answers in that you're thinking about it and you're bringing in expertise and knowledge from other places. What I'd really wanted to understand a little bit better, and this kind of speaks to Councillor Henderson's point about the South and the West, what are we going to do through that design process to make sure that we are getting input, that we're testing ideas, that we're talking about mitigations with some of the really impacted groups? So I'm thinking, for example, Etu would be a really good one. They represent a lot of the cleaners who would be here in the central city in the middle of the night, for example. Auckland, sorry, I only remember the acronym AAAP, Auckland Advocacy Against Poverty, I think. Auckland, anyway, that one. Action Against Poverty, there we go. Who would be another one who would have a lot of really good connections in that space? City Centre Residents Group, the National Council on themselves. Obviously, I've stepped back from that as a branch member. So what's the plan around having that conversation with those kinds of groups and testing some of those mitigation ideas about what will actually practically work, so that we can get some assurance before we go forward from the next stage? Yes, we do have a robust system to deal with those equity issues, because I think that's what a lot of us are looking for.
So that is the whole purpose of that work stream too. We haven't written that plan yet, but we acknowledge that we're going to need to have a deep and layered engagement on this. The cleaner point though, in a lot of cases, if you are just charging peak hours of 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and or 3 to 5, depending on what those hours are, a lot of those people are not caught by that. And that's deliberate, so that if you are coming in at 3 a.m, the only way you can get here is drive, because there's no public transport. Those workers would not be caught by any scheme that we have considered up until now. Similarly, city dwellers, will want to have a conversation about getting out of the cordon as opposed to getting into it. And again, that has been considered, and there are a number of treatments that we could consider when we're looking at the design of the scheme. So I can't give you a specific plan yet on that engagement, but acknowledge your points, and we would want to invite all of those people to give their views and listen to their views, including mana whenua and Mātawaka. We did an original or I did when I started as Program Director for Congestion Charging paper to the Kaitiaki Forum, and there's been a specific paper that was commissioned, part of the congestion question work, that looked at the impacts on Māori as well, and that recommends very early engagement and very co-design almost principles in some of the equity mitigations.
Great. What sort of time frame are we looking at for that kind of work? Because I think this is where I get a little nervous that we do the mitigations as a sort of, okay, we've got the scheme and now, how do we do the mitigations? But that sounds to me much more like it's built in, which is, I think, the approach we should be taking. So how do some of the timeframes line up for that?
It's very much in parallel with all the work streams. So we need to kick it off pretty quickly and straight away and get some of these work streams designed up. But you would see some of that engagement starting pretty early in the new year.
Okay. I just flag up the opportunity to talk to advisory panels. I think they'd be really useful for giving some really good nuanced advice on some of the advocacy space. There's a disability one, there's one for Pacific peoples and ethnic communities, as well as seniors and Rainbow, so really good opportunity there. Thank you.
All right, 7 questioners to go. Councillor Turner.
Thank you, I'll be quick. Boy, we can make simple things complicated, can't we? I sit here with all sorts of considerations, which to a degree are academic and abstract. Thinking of the process, which has already taken 7 years, and that management practice called agile, which I understand means fail and fail fast. I'm not expecting you to fail, but is there some way we can just put up, can you identify somewhere where we can put up a practice site, where we can get one of those cameras that they're talking about at the presentation earlier, one at each end, and come back here with data saying we exempted the people living on the street, we only caught the ones running down the rat run, they stopped in the first 2 months but then all came back to a greater, and most importantly, it stops myself as a councillor sitting here 2 years from now being told you can't change your vote because you voted for this on stage 1, then stage 2 and stage 3. Thank you.
I'm delighted with your question. We have actually done that. We set up a cordon around Wynyard Quarter, and in fact learned from that wasn't very useful, so put cameras up on the gantries in Nelson Street to look at the data that we would collect, whether we could read the number plates of cars going at certain speeds, the types of vehicles, so that we could make sure we could exempt, for example, buses or charge trucks and motorbikes different tariffs. So we have done a proof of technology trial must have been in 2022, and we got some rich data from that that we'll take forward to the design phase.
But I'd like to see a proof of reaction trial, you know, so that we've actually got something in place where a certain portion of our public are allowed to choose between the motorway and New North Road, like I do each morning, you know.
Fortunately, there are a number of international schemes that have been operating for a long time. Singapore all the way back into the 1970s, London 2003, Stockholm 2006. And the Stockholm scheme in particular, they had a very specific political arrangement where they implemented the scheme for 6 months. During that 6 months, traffic levels dropped by 20%, which meant congestion was almost entirely disappeared from the centre of Stockholm, and then they closed the system. Traffic levels increased back to essentially where they were just before the scheme started. Then they had a referendum which voted to implement the scheme again. They brought in the scheme, this time on a permanent basis. The traffic went back down another 20% again and got rid of congestion. So we've seen that in live experience in Stockholm, and the ongoing the benefits they received have been ongoing since for a long time.
Thank you. Very last. That's great, but you did just point out a few minutes ago that New Zealand isn't Singapore. I know you're talking Stockholm. I'm talking about us, and I'm talking about practical, and I'm talking about measured results involving people. Thanks.
Councillor Sayers?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. My question is just around the use of the revenue stream that will come in from it. So I'm just under the impression that that's likely to be used for public transport initiatives. So I'm just wondering, is it within the scope of this political reference group to discuss how that revenue stream is used? And in other words, you know, will any be going into road capital projects or road maintenance projects? Just clarification around that.
I can try that one.
Okay.
I think the legislation will define some of it, so we're waiting to see what the enabling legislation allows in that space. But if we assume that it'll be hypothecated to the region where it's collected, which is the correct, I believe, assumption, all of that is open for conversation, and I think that the political reference group could well have an influence on that. There's been no decisions taken today.
And the revenue policy work stream that's sitting in this proposal will give us a chance to talk through all that. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
I'll reserve my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. That's helpful. Councillor Newman.
Yes, thank you. A couple of questions from me, but if you are looking to expand the reference group, Chair, I want to give notice that I'm interested in joining it as a Southern Ward councillor. But actually, I think that you do have to draw a line. So if that's where you want to draw the line, that's fine, Chair. My question to the officers is that, and I certainly can, I can certainly see the benefit of a congestion charge where the entry points to the area subject to the charge is concentrated on the city centre as opposed to the wider state highway network through the central isthmus. But we are talking about state roads here, not local roads. So can I understand, who do you think will have jurisdiction over these gantries, these charge points on the state highway network? Who will determine that? And if it's not Auckland Transport, what role do you think you will have? Those are my first questions.
It hasn't been decided where those gantry points will be, and you're quite right, if they're on the state highways it makes it slightly more complicated than if they're on Auckland arterial roads. But the governance group that's set up will look at that. I also anticipate that the legislation will deal with some of that. So again, my understanding from the draft legislation that was starting to be prepared was that this was going to be regionally managed and regionally enjoying of the benefits, put it that way. So I think that we will have to sort through a lot of those details in both the revenue policy work and the governance work streams.
And even if the gantries are on the state highway network, the burden will fall on the adjacent arterial roads and the roads operated by Auckland Transport. So we have to make sure we have the capacity to run a system that caters for those who may decide not to be on the state highway network anymore. So there is a good argument for the revenue to go to improve those alternatives off the state highway, in addition to Auckland not having any other substantial revenue source from car drivers, whereas the central government, of course, has the fuel excise duty and the road user charge already. So they have quite large revenue streams from motorists, whereas Auckland, the burden falls almost entirely on ratepayers.
The report at 12 through to 14 or 15 refers to the legislation, the history of that. I mean, the legislation was sponsored by somebody who's no longer a minister, no longer an MP actually, and offered, but other parties, from my good understanding, declined to participate in that at that time, wanting to prepare their own legislation. What's the risk here that the revenue that you might see garnered from a congestion charge mandated and triggered by vehicles moving through the state highway network, that the revenue is then used to address the core priorities of the new government through its GPS in relation to highway improvements that it wants, for example, East-West Link Mill Road, which would probably not be where you'd want that funding to go.
My understanding is that that will not be the case. We won't know until we see that legislation. But part of the select committee process had multi-party support for the principles that were outlined in making this about the region as opposed to the nation.
I think the East-West Link and Mill Road would be very much regional priorities. But I think, can I just ask, so your expectation could be that the revenue would be raised, obviously it would be raised in the region, but it may well be that it is reflecting what the GPS states as the core priorities for revenue to fund the mix of capital projects, ready to go to Greg Sayer's point around road corridors, state highway corridors. That is a live option, isn't it?
I hesitate to say, but we just don't know yet. We don't know where the scheme will be and where those cordons will be, and they may not be on state highways. They may be.
I think.
Okay. And just
sorry, through you, Chair. There's a lot to work through in this revenue space, and you're hitting on all the issues, Councillor. Even the impact of the GPS on this revenue is not clear, because the GPS directs government expenditure. So there's a lot to work through here. You're absolutely hitting on the right stuff. But the revenue work stream is designed to really tease this out. And once we've got some clarity on the legislation, we can input into legislation design before it's finalised through government, but also, we need clarity on it going forward.
So, and just to conclude, so your input into legislation would be through the submissions process. You don't necessarily have a guarantee that you would be co-drafting this with officials from MOT, and I mean, you might like to, but there's no guarantee of that, is there?
Yeah, we certainly want to work and collaborate with MOT in terms of that role, but it's their role to advise ministers on the legislation that goes through. We understand MOT has done a lot of work there, but they're waiting for direction from the new government, and we have to await that ourselves.
Chair, I'd like to speak to this later on. Thank you.
Oh, good. Councillor Darby?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Chair, for incorporating those amendments, endorsing the program, the 12-point program, and adding as soon as practicable, as the Mayor and I discussed, was important to add. Just in terms of that as soon as practicable to the team, I think this is I think this kicked off under Mayor Len Brown. We've gone through Mayor Goff, now we're with Mayor Brown again, a different Mayor Brown. And it's not like we have not been discussing many of the issues that have been raised here today. I mean, we've seen a lot of reports on this. So my question back to you is, considering the amount of work that's gone on this here, central government, select committees, etc., how can we move towards an earlier delivery than the expected, 2026, when the City Rail link and everything is so-called finished? I mean, we're unfolding hundreds of millions of dollars of infrastructure and public transport solutions every year. The network does not reflect how it looked 2 years ago or 5 years ago. So could you comment on, if we can address these outstanding questions, or the questions lodged again, in your eyes, can we see something that is pre-CRL delivery?
It's the legislation that's on the critical path, and it depends on its path through the House and how quickly that can happen. So that's one of the things where we can't really control the time frame in that regard. One of the reasons for linking it with CRL is because the opening of CRL provides people from the south and the west much more frequent and reliable rail services. It's after the rail network renewal program completes, and so part of the respect for people and providing them other opportunities to get into town and avoid the charge was why the program was linked with the opening of the CRL. There's no practical reason why it couldn't happen prior to the opening of CRL, but you just prevent people from having more choices to get into town if the cordons around the city in particular.
And Councillor, to be really frank, to start the work now, we're going to need some funding. And we need to think about that in the LTP process, because the design phase, even to get us to the design readiness to kick in, is going to need to be funded to start this year. So that needs to come into play as well for us to really kick off tomorrow.
Second question, and I've got three, one short one after, Chair. The question of equity. The question of equity is a very interesting one, and one we have to really delve into. Not like we haven't, but we will continue to delve into. But I'm interested in the part of equity which we don't address, and that is we're often consumed with or focused on equity addressing those that might be disadvantaged. But as we've seen in schemes around the world, if you really honestly address equity, you have to look at those that might be advantaged as well. And there's a lot of criticism of schemes around the world that give priority lanes to prosperous drivers. So in our inquiry into equity, are we going to be looking at how to avoid the outcomes that have shown up in some parts of the world where a priority lane for prosperous drivers has been delivered? And then my last one, Michael, is the public engagement. I'm expecting that we start to engage in the participatory democratic processes. That's an assumption. Okay, go back to my second question then.
So we're not looking at tolling any specific lanes and providing faster travel for only those drivers who want to pay a toll. We're looking at a time of use charge over whatever sections of road network are applied. So there are no so-called Lexus lanes for rich people in particular. Not sure if that's answered your question exactly.
When you do charge, those that for those where a charge makes no difference are those that are on higher incomes, and therefore you are providing road space, and they get a priority because they can pay and they don't care about the cost, as evidenced in London. That's what I'm referring to. So when we address equity, how do we address that? It's a tough nut to crack, but...
Well, location is a critical part of that. We are not anticipating charging the outer urban areas where people have less ability to pay. So by focusing the charge on areas of higher income, higher property value, we are asking those with more money to contribute much more to the revenue that this scheme would generate. And I think it's important to remember in our transport system, although we think of the long trips into the city centre, the average car trip in New Zealand is 5 kilometres long. So the people in South Auckland and West Auckland, most of them very rarely travel into the city centre. And it's those in the inner suburbs that travel much more to the city centre, and they're ones living in much higher value homes and earning higher incomes in general. So a lot of the revenue is focused on those higher income areas, not at all on the lower income areas.
I think it's a great call out through you, Chair, Councillor, because we often think of equity in the space, as you've said, of those disadvantaged by a scheme. And when we put this out to our communities and our public, that's going to get raised. So we do need to bring that into the thinking, into the work stream. So it's a good insight.
And regarding the deliberative issue, we recently ran a deliberative forum looking at the future of Auckland's transport system, and we will report back to the December TIC meeting on the outcomes. But the provisional data there showed that we tested 4 pricing schemes with the people involved who were representative of Auckland's entire population. Initially, they did not have a very positive view of those schemes. None of them had net level of support. They all had a level of disagreement. But after the process went through and people had a chance to spend the 2 days working together, look at issues from other people's perspective, listen to experts, it was actually the pricing initiatives that had a much larger increase in vote than any other, because that extra information enabled people to really consider what issues are at stake and acknowledge that it can't just all be about carrots. We need some sticks if we want to build a better transport system, that someone has to pay for it, and it's a matter of choosing who should pay for it. Should it only be the ratepayers, or should it be some of those who benefit directly from the scheme? So we are keen to do a deliberative democracy process, and I do believe that will help address many of the equity concerns and come up with some of those detailed arrangements of exactly who does deserve an exemption or a discount. And some of those tough design issues can be dealt with by actually the residents, the citizens of Auckland, through a deliberative process.
All right, and we would hope a number of these will pick up in the looking at the benefits and disbenefits. So we've still got a number of questions, so could we perhaps bear that in mind just in the questions and the answers too? So we've got a debate to get to, and there's a number of people who have indicated a willingness to speak there as well. So last 3, Councillor Bartley, Councillor Hills and Councillor Filipina.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask similar questions to what's being raised around equity, but probably asking how robust is that information that officers have about who's coming into the city, because anecdotally, you know, a lot of us would know a lot of our communities from South and West that are coming into the city that don't have a choice of working from home, are in those low skilled jobs, so wouldn't be able to negotiate times of, you know, start times and finish times with their employers. So really wanting to delve more into that, because I still have the same concerns I had when I voted against this when it came to planning committee, that it is going to be those that are on lower incomes that are going to be hit hardest by this. So that's my question, please.
A lot of the research was done quite some time ago and pre-COVID, and I know that the Ministry of Transport, in their wrapping up of the congestion question work, got a consultant to relook at a lot of that data to do with demographics and equity issues. So that's been refreshed in around about 2022. But part of the work that we need to do is to revalidate that, because the city is different at the end of 2023 than it was at the beginning of 2022. So I think it's a very good point that we just need to make sure that we're actually speaking about current data instead of old research. So that has been considered and built into this work program.
And also,
sorry, one more.
Sorry, Councillor
Sorry,
Bartley, by targeting city centre areas, we're also targeting employment. And almost by definition, that's targeting those, well, they have an income, so they're not the poorest in our society. And in that context, it is less than a quarter of the car trips in Auckland that are going to or from work. There are more shopping trips in Auckland than there are commutes to work. There are more visit family and friends trips in Auckland than there are trips to work. And most of these trips are in the local area. We know that data, that is quite comprehensive. It's not just data that it was performed previously for the congestion question. It's data through the census and through the household travel survey. So there will be people negatively impacted, and we need to deal with that. But that is not the overwhelming majority of people. It is certainly a small minority.
Thank you, Chair. And just one more, please. The questions that I am getting from more residents is about, you know, if this starts in Ellerslie or Green Lane, has anything been looked at? Because those areas are already congested, and we're just going to add to it more if people are going to avoid the motorway and they're just going to fill up the suburbs nearby.
That'll certainly be taken into account in the detailed design. We'll look at the rat runs, if you like, or the areas of the network will likely have unintended consequences.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bartley, and I think two important points out of that we want the most up-to-date data because things have changed, and I think with respect of Councillor Henderson's point earlier on in terms of geographic spread, I think that motion or sub-clause that goes to impact on communities would by definition have to involve the ward councillors who represent those areas which will be affected by that, and I think the reference committee would be honour bound to bring those people in to make sure they heard their view. Would that be your intention, Mr. Mayor?
It is.
Yeah, okay. All right, Councillor Hills and Councillor Philippon.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair. Some questions. First on we're talking about just the cost to people, but it's not really, seem to be missing the savings that are potentially, not only time, but as far as I could understand, congestion costs about 20 to 40% extra on your fuel bill every week. So have we been modelling the reduction in congestion? You know, you're paying a couple, $3, but you might actually be saving, if you're saving 40% of a tank a week, you know, how are we telling that story better? Because isn't that part of the point?
It's a really good point. Work has been done on that, certainly motor vehicle performance, but also I think someone raised the point about well-being and anxiety and stress of being in congestion, which is very difficult to monetise, but we need to tell those stories.
Thank you. The charge, I think in London, and it's probably unhelpful that I see media and others have used London, but they charge about 30 New Zealand dollars a day, so £15. What are the sort of numbers? The Mayor's put out there $5, but I don't think that's what's proposed. What are you sort of thinking?
The original modelling that went to the select committee was about $3.50 per trip with a daily cap of $7, so again that one in, one out. But all of that has to be revalidated. Those numbers are quite old now.
Thank you. Is there a risk? I've seen that Simeon Brown in August said that they would, speed up legislation on this. They would make it a priority to allow it, and every party in Parliament, as far as I understand, supports this direction, which confuses me why it's taken so long if all parties support it, which is usually quite an unusual thing. But is it risky to be now choosing a slightly different type of charging that was proposed in the kind of unanimous support through Select Committee? I mean, I know time of use is different to the congestion charging or the zone that was presented, but are we adding too much complexity by changing what was originally sort of proposed?
I don't think so. I think that the two options that went through the Select Committee process, one was a cordon around the city and the other one was a charge on strategic corridors, which is much more in the lines of time of use charging than a hard cordon around the city like London's. So I don't believe so, but again, the devil's in the detail of the legislation, and until we see it, we don't really know.
Thank you. Have we looked at the Greater Washington or other examples where they have really good automatic equity discounts that are, against your tax rate or registration, things like that, around those, so it's not hard for people to apply for?
I'm not personally familiar with those, but I'm not sure where we got to with those.
It's based on income as far as I know, so.
That could be fed into the process, I think, Councillor Hills.
And one last question, I have asked this before through the TERP discussions, but can we get a bit of updated figures, if possible, on those numbers like Councillor Bartley said? Because as far as I understand, it is by far wealthier people who are driving far more kilometres than those on lower income. The effects, I think we make a lot of assumptions based on anecdotes, and I'm not saying those anecdotes are wrong, but the actual figures I'd like to see a bit better, and maybe the effects for those people might be sort of cost neutral or even better. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, finally, Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies for not being there, but as Councillor Newman said earlier, I'm not feeling that well look, I've got some very quick questions, Chair. Firstly, I just want to acknowledge the presenters. My first one is on legislative change. So I know that we'll need the legislative change for the motorway of congestion charging, or what we're trying to at least get a process about implementation. So is that still the case in regards to state highways?
So through you, Chair, we need a legislative enabling change to put this in place, absolutely. And we're just waiting for MOT and the government to indicate when that's going to happen.
Will that also apply to our streets or streets within our region?
Yes, it does.
I also, just a question, Chair, maybe to you or to our presenters. The political reference groups, I'm assuming, is not a decision-making group?
Yes, I think that's right. The political reference group will have to bring anything back to the full. Yes, you're correct, Councillor Filipaina.
Oh, thank you, Chair. And I'm assuming it'll either come back to a workshop, or will it come back straight to your committee, Chair?
I would think this would have to be workshopped. Definitely, yes. And then back to this committee or the GB. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, because I think that'll be a good process. Goes to a workshop and then to your committee, Chair. Just a question to the presenters. I heard somebody talk about, I think it was a governance. There was a comment made around a governance group. Can I confirm that the governance group, and I forgot one of the ladies who said it, that you're referring to the political reference group and not another group? Can I confirm that?
So there's through you, Chair, there's two references to governance. The reference group that was set up under the recommendations is the governance of this governing body around the project. There's also a work stream in the project which looks at some of the governance arrangements of how the scheme is governed. and who owns what and who does what around collection and gantries and all that kind of thing.
Okay, but there's nothing there, even in the recommendations around the governance group. Is that what you're calling them?
So the recommendations through your chair are recommending the setup of a governance group, if you like, or I have to get my glasses on. Political reference group, thank you, and that's set up through your recommendation for this council, and that will be your governance opportunity.
I can add to that. There will be internal program governance, and there'll be working groups that feed to that program governance to then bring things to the political reference group. So there will be another layer of governance underneath, and as Jenny said, there'll be actual governance on the implementation of the scheme, who owns which parts of it once it's running.
Okay, so that needs to be explicit, because people who have contacted me over the last few days are saying, and they've wanted to ensure that the political reference group is not a decision-making one, and the chair's confirmed it's not. A governance group from their perspective is a decision-making one. So I think the terminology needs to be very clear in regards to that. There's also, can I just confirm with the presenters that the recommendation that we have in it may be with you as well, Chair, but the recommendation is to implement a way forward in regards to the work. It is not implementing the congestion charging, because people are, Chair, people are saying to me, no, I don't want this to be implemented now, and I'm saying it's not around the implementing of.
Yes, I think that was in there originally, and that word's been changed to progress. So yes, not implementation. Cool. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. And the last question to the presenters was the London example that's been mentioned. Do they know the amount that it was first put to the community in London, and how much they are currently paying now?
Thank you for the question. I believe it started at around £5, and it has increased to £15 now. It started in 2003, so that is 20 years ago. There has been a lot of inflation in the last 20 years. But yeah, our prices would be well below anything London charges. Oslo charges about $5 a trip, and Stockholm, I believe, a figure similar to that as comparison.
And sorry, Chair, last question. Somebody again mentioned, and I don't know who it was, it may have been you, Jenny, this is my last question, and you said that there was some work done, that the council may have decided that the congestion charging will be an addition to the regional fuel tax. I'm interested to see whether Auckland Council made the decision, having been on the council since 2010. Yeah, I'll be interested, was that a decision that the council had agreed with, or was that from Auckland Transport? Thank you, Chair.
Through you, just to clarify, what I mentioned at the start was that at your last workshop you asked us to push forward with the design of a scheme to implement this as a matter of a priority for you. Its relationship to RFT is that they are quite separate, and we don't know what's going to happen with the RFT councillor, but the recommendation from the council was to push forward with this scheme as a priority because that's what you wanted.
Yeah, priority, but there's been no decision made that this congestion charging, if the regional fuel tax stays, that they will be alongside of each other. There's no decision that's been made. I just wanted to clear that up.
And there was a council resolution in May 2021 that any net revenue from the scheme would be directed towards improving the equity outcomes, and including public transport, and if there were any remaining revenue, that could then go to reduce the regional fuel tax.
If I could just come in, Councillor Philippina, because that's a very good question that I'm sure is on a number of councillors' mind, and the exact wording of that resolution that's on the books from that 6th of May meeting was A3, that revenue collected, and this was from congestion pricing, in addition to that needed to operate the scheme and to address equity and provision of public transport services, and as revenue and costs allow, replace the regional fuel tax. So it certainly chucked in that notion that you're alluding to about the, you know, the status of the regional fuel tax, and that needs to be seriously looked at, because for a number of people who voted in that day, obviously it was on the basis that there would be a replacement, be one, not both.
Yeah, so, that's why I asked. So, kia ora, Chair, ngā kia ora, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Filipaina. If our presenters wouldn't mind moving back now, we have the recommendations by committee almost, that have been moved by the Mayor and seconded by Deputy Chair Councillor Fletcher. We have a number of councillors who did not ask questions, who have asked to have a short speaking slot, and of course that's open to other people too, but I hope we're mindful of the time we've had on this already. Mr. Mayor. Yeah, so you're leading it off. You're moving it.
Okay, thanks for everybody on this so far, and you know it's got a long history. I'm kind of a bit worried we're at risk of forgetting what this is about, which is actually fixing Auckland, and that means fixing the terrible congestion of Auckland that is costing around $1 billion a year. We've wandered into the weeds. We have known jams in known places at known times every working day. That's what it's about. Don't lose sight of that. I'm determined to address this issue. It will require a range of interventions, including investment in addressing congestion hotspots, which is what this is, reducing the plague of road cones that affects our city, and building better public transport like busways. Time of use is a mitigation in itself. You've talked about mitigations. It is a mitigation against the costs of congestion. However, an essential part of addressing our congestion is time of use charging. It'll mean charging vehicles to travel on congested major roads at peak times in particular motorways. We already have emergency avoidance systems on Grafton Bridge. If you have, I split my head open in an accident a few years ago, and we crossed Grafton Bridge, blood gushing out of my head. In there, my son drove. We got a bill for going across Grafton Bridge, and then we sent them the pictures of the fact that I'd been admitted to hospital, and they admitted it. We already have, and you have all supported, we have time of use charging at the Port of Auckland. We are now charging the trucks more to collect their goods during daytime than at night, in an effort to free up congestion off the motorways. This is a good thing. Don't get lost in it. The aim of time of charging is to encourage a small number of people currently travelling to change their travel time, travel this destination, or switch to public transport. This allows most people on the road a much faster and more reliable journey, which will be cheaper for them. Everyone benefits. The people out west benefit way more than this than the people out east. Previous work has showed that when our motorways are functioning more like they currently do in the school holidays. I know I'm quite happy to have included there that we consider wider issues of equity, but everybody pays the same price for petrol. Everybody pays the same amount for a warrant of fitness. Everybody pays the same amount for registration. But if there's a need for some help in this, that will be accommodated. We've already heard that technically it's very easy. If you are disabled, you should have a permit on your car. That number will be noted. Those people can easily be relieved from this. Staff are asking us today to further work to progress the scheme towards implementation, including addressing the issues that have been raised today. That's good, but it is in danger of becoming incredibly complex. 12 steps to do something or other. You wonder how many steps there is to walk across the room and open a door. This work will include looking at which roads are most appropriate to charge, but it's not hard to work out. When there's the ones that are most jammed, those are the ones that give the most relief. And when? Sooner better. Really, this work was started in this council under Mayor Len Brown. Under Mayor Goff, it progressed nowhere. We've passed resolutions. It has to start. The march of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. Boy, we haven't made it yet. Another important, we'll look at the mitigations and exemptions for emergency vehicles, mobility card holders, low-income earners, and so on. That's fair enough. Council needs to have an oversight of this issue. As well as full council workshops that will occur, I'm supporting a political oversight group that involves a range of councillors with responsibilities in relationship to that. This will ensure council's concerns are heard and will be used to direct investigations. And we will keep control. This will not be, as Peter said, led by AT. They will implement this. This is urgent. Don't expect to be voted in if we haven't done this at the next time, for those of you worried about that. I want this underway as soon as possible. The government itself, past governments have been drawing legislation. It's pretty well drawn up. They just squabbled over it because there's an election coming. I do want staff to work at pace on this so the scheme can be implemented as soon as it is practical. At the same time, I'm encouraging the new Minister of Transport to get on and pass legislation so we can not only proceed with this, but other legislation like parking fines. There will be pressure on them. I don't want it to be too slow or too complicated. It's simple. Sydney, you can't drive around Sydney without paying for being on the motorway. Not possible. And that's not actually, they speak English and they even play rugby. You might have heard of them. So I'm very happy with the wording, which includes enough people to represent every area. And you can rest assured, we're not going to pick on the West because you're not there. The West will be a immediate beneficiary. The North is already benefiting from having a busway. The South and the West don't have that yet, or East. So I'm looking forward to this being approved and us getting on with it, please. All right, thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, with that emotional plea there at the end. Councillor Fletcher, do you want to exercise your right as the seconder?
I want to speak just briefly, and that is to say this has been around, that I'm aware of, since 1993. If I go back to 1993, I was chairing the then Transport and Environment Select Committee, and we had, using the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, we had a select committee inquiry. I can't remember what it was called, but it was basically into public transport. And one of the recommendations that came out at that stage was the need for actually having some provision for congestion charging. I had the great privilege of travel. The British government funded me back in my parliamentary years to actually go and see what they were trying to do in the UK. I've subsequently gone back, I might add at my own cost, on a regular basis to monitor how it's progressed. I have monitored how it's going in Singapore. I have monitored how it's going in Sydney and in other parts of Australia that seem to have some reference to what we're trying to do. This does not replace the need for building more roads. We will still need more roads. And for the purists amongst us who say, no, we won't have any more roads, I say, no, this is just simply using the resources we have better. The only concern that I have is that we are addressing those issues, particularly around the role and responsibility that women tend to carry more so than men for working with families that are old and young, that are disabled and well-abled. But to suggest that this is something radical that's just popped up overnight, I mean, Bernard Orsman was sitting in the press gallery causing me a lot of trouble back in 1993, as I remember. Prior to the introduction of MMP, he managed to quote from a speech that I made that was somewhat unfortunate about Peter Dunn at that then time. But, you know, I just say that in jest, but this is, he didn't hear, he's busy working away.
Busy shafting you again.
He's just shafting me again, yeah. He took a quote at the time where I was trying to show that MMP would allow people to vote for the electorate MP that they wanted rather than the political party. So he interpreted, which probably was true, that I was supporting Peter Dunn over the National Party candidate at that time, and it got me into all manner of trouble. However, this is not new. If we are serious about making progress in New Zealand, it's been really hard, those points that we can look at, and we talk about the North Shore Busway all the time, and we talk about other points of progression, but we never really understand how bad we are at implementing things. This is an opportunity for us to come together, to sit down with the incoming government and say, we must be serious about that. I heard in my parliamentary years, and then subsequently as mayor, I heard from all political parties, oh, we really like this. Yes, we really want to do this, but it's just too hard electorally. We can't do it. Well, I say it's time to actually be courageous and to not be driven just by the 3-year electoral cycle and the trouble it might get you into. This is a time for genuine commitment to dealing with the congestion issues that just plague us all. This shouldn't be seen as something that we're adding to the misery of households who can't cope now financially. We've got to address that as well. We've actually got to show much greater empathy as we move into the LTP about the plight of people right now. This is simply designed that we can allow our industry and our businesses to get on with what they need to do, that those who need to be on the motorways and those important road networks, that if they have an important task to do, they can get on and do it. And I believe that people will look back and say, oh, why did it take so long? This is something we must do, and I applaud the Mayor for bringing it to the table, and I will be supporting this.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some reservations about this, and it is quite true. This issue and various iterations of it has been before the council for many, many years now, and quite right. People who recalled it was Mayor Len Brown who initiated, I forget the name of this group because it went on for quite a long time, so I should remember it, but it was the Alternative Funding Consensus Group, or words to that effect. And I remember the word consensus because there was quite a lot of public scepticism about it. Right. And I think the activist, the late Penny Bright, referred to it as the conned senseless group. But anyway, that didn't proceed under the Key government, under the English government, under the Ardern government for a number of practical and political reasons, and that is why we still don't have it. I'm not really convinced by officers comparing Auckland to Singapore, Stockholm and London. Auckland, in terms of public transport, is probably the worst performing city in the comparator group in Australasia and North America, and I note that in Australia they don't have the system, but they have much better public transport, and that is a great model for us to emulate if we wanted to, but we certainly haven't done that. There are also a fundamental contradiction coming through and that's always bedevilled this program, or versions of it, and that contradiction is between revenue raising and extra money, which makes people bright-eyed and hopeful, and changing behaviour, which is another perennial goal of officialdom. And of course, the problem is if the behaviour is changed, and if demand management works and there's reduction of demand, there goes the extra revenue that people are hopeful to get their hands on. So that's another problem which is not new. Personally speaking, I worry about the equity. We've heard the word equity coming up, but I worry about the word equity because the people who are most enthusiastic for the scheme, always have been, are people, are official people, and you know, corporate managers and so on. Their charges will be reimbursed for sure on their expenses accounts. It's the ordinary working people who have no other choice who'll be paying the bulk of this. And you know, I heard one of the officers talk about, you know, it shouldn't be the ratepayer who pays, you know, for all of these expenses. Other people have to pay. Well, quite often, more often than not, the people who will be paying this congestion charge are ratepayers and paying arguably the highest rates in the country already. So that's another concern about equity. And if we are really sincere about equity, then the likelihood of extra revenue is going to melt away very quickly. Now, the other concern I have is that there's absolutely no mention of any business case. No mention at all. We are endorsing, so it's already underway. So we're here to rubber stamp approval after the fact, by the sound of things. The concern is, how much is this going to cost? You know, we don't have any in-house capability to do this stuff. Virtually nothing operational is done by local government anymore. It's all outsourced. So we'll be relying on private sector suppliers. And as there's not this scheme or a version of the scheme in Australia, probably from further afield, how much will that cost? What about their profits? What about their return to shareholders? So they'll be having a grab at the revenue as well, not just Auckland Council and AT. And of course then there's the big end of town, the PwCs, the Deloittes, our legal friends. They'll be clipping the ticket as well. So again, the chances of getting extra money for Auckland Council and AT may not be that great. I wouldn't bet on it. The fact of the matter is, members, is that we're talking about state highways. We're talking about something the central government is responsible for and built and pays for and maintains, and we're expecting them for us to tax their customers, if you will, and take the money. Well, they may not be forthcoming. And when we hear officers saying there's a broad party consensus to bring the scheme in, well, be careful what you wish for, because it may not be the scheme you have in mind. And bearing in mind, we all know there's sensitive policy discussions going on right now about what will be the new cross-party consensus in the new coalition government, and it may not include this. So again, I would feel a lot more comfortable, rather than presenting with the incoming government some sort of fait accompli in Auckland, that we actually sit down and show some respect to the new government and hear what their policies are, not what ours are. They've just been elected, they have a mandate. And so I think a respectful pause before we preempt things and come up with fait accomplis for new, possibly inexperienced ministers is the right way to go, not what we are doing right now.
Could you wind up, please, Councillor?
I think I'll leave it at that. Oh, just one more point, one more contradiction, and that is the claim that you can't build your way out of congestion. And there's some truth to this. You know, you build an extra lane on the motorway and it'll get filled up. But this council, Auckland Transport, Panuku, the whole family, they have a policy not of building our way out of congestion, but actually building our way into congestion not by building extra lanes, but by removing traffic lanes, especially in the inner city. And again, there's a muddle and a strategic contradiction in all of that. So we're actually creating congestion. I got the 501 bus. It took me 15 minutes to get from Albert Street up to Walee's, 15 minutes. And part of that is because all the lanes are constricted now. So obviously, if we're going to open the doors to immigration, and our population has increased significantly over recent months, and then we're deconstructing traffic lanes, what do you expect? So I can't support this. I believe we need to sit down and talk to the new Minister of Transport, the new Minister for Auckland, the new Prime Minister, and then work our way forward on that basis, but not present the incoming government with some sort of fait accompli jacked up by Auckland Council and AT, who have no responsibility for the state highway system. We've got plenty of our own work to get on with.
Okay.
Thank you.
Point of order. Yeah. That was a long while. Yeah. No, it wasn't 10 minutes. Okay. We've got a number of other speakers lined up. Councillors Newman, Turner, Councillor Ferry, did you indicate you wanted to speak? Yes, Councillor Ferry, Henderson, Dalton, Walker, and myself. Yes. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, look, thanks, Chair. I mean, look, Mike Lee does raise a number of important points here, and nobody participating in this debate is on a low income, and nobody who has contributed to the report that we're considering, I would anticipate, would be on a low income. So we can all afford the consequences of our advocacy in terms of our own life and our own experience. But there are people that a number of us represent who will struggle. I think it is important. I think Councillor Lee is right. Be careful what you wish for, because I can see a government looking at this and saying, well, much like we don't get the sort of far rate that we need for the maintenance of the existing road network, central government has proven before that it isn't as generous as we would like it to be. Generosity is not about giving us a whole lot of tax powers. Generosity is about maybe recognising that the Crown's contribution towards our capital costs and the consequential operating cost would be met, but how often is it not? Chair, I do think it's important for those listening to this to understand that there is currently a discussion which we are all having to participate in workshops, and it will very quickly come to the fore as the extent to which we will have to make significant cuts to Auckland Transport's capital and operating budgets for the 10-year plan. And I put my hand up to say that I most certainly will be supporting scenarios to do that, and it will run into very, very large numbers, and it has to. Similarly, Chair, yesterday we had a workshop on VKT which just proposed astronomical numbers which are quite unaffordable. The unfunded mandates around this, Chair, another term for unfunded mandates is a broken promise. And we've been breaking promises in the transport space for a very long time. But the unfunded mandates are going to need to be wound back. And I think that's important. We need to be seen to be doing that and doing that for our budget, but also too so that Aucklanders can see that this is not always just about a revenue grab. But make no mistake, Chair, what we are seeking here, whatever the reference group, the discussions around this table, it will be for Parliament, it'll be for the Cabinet to decide what it does in this space, and the Cabinet will determine the design of legislation, and the Cabinet will determine who will benefit from the revenue, and it will be the GPS that will largely set the blueprint for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Newman. Councillor Turner, then Councillor Ferry.
Thank you. My plea is keep it simple, keep it focused. Don't try to make it everything to everybody, as in social outcomes and equity outcomes and all that sort of stuff. We're all having to use the streets, we're all having to get around, we're all having to navigate our city. Keep it simple, keep it focused, and then the public can measure it, we can measure it, and we can debate it. I do have one concern. When I come to work in the mornings, every morning into here, I check my Google Maps, and it's usually only a minute or two difference between going down the motorway or going through Point Chev, going past Motat and Western Springs. And I make the choice basically that if you're on the motorway and it looks as though it's slow, if something was to have gone wrong, there's no escape route. So at that point in time, the only thing that will change my decision is the cost. And I just worry that having this only on the motorways will actually force people back into rat running through the cities. And so I really want this to have some sort of test fast and a slow and progressive approach so that we can test ourselves each way along practically and report on it and justify it or otherwise. I do worry about this resolution, Mr. Chair, where it starts with endorse. I'm happy to progress, but at this point in time, I'm not happy to endorse because we're not at a place where we can endorse yet. So I'll take a little bit of, if I can vote on this and go against A, just because I'm endorsing something that we haven't really settled on, but I do think that we need to progress and test. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Turner. Councillor Ferry.
Thank you. I'll try and be brief, although Councillor Lee did remind me about the Consensus Building Group, which I do vaguely remember, and I've brought up their report, and looking at some of the people who participated in that and the organisations they represented, actually quite a helpful list in terms of some of those equity concerns that a number of us were raising earlier. So the group working on this might want to have a look there. There's people like Walk Auckland, Child Poverty Action Group, Cycle Action Auckland, Council Trade Unions, alongside people from the airport, the AA. So that might be a starter for some of those design conversations. So I support this work going forward. I really think we need to move on with this. I think we do need to step carefully on the equity stuff, but I took a lot of comfort from the advice we were getting from staff there about how they're going to progress that. And I'll be looking for that to be right at the front of the report backs we get as this progresses through. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor Ferry. Councillor Henderson.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And just thank everyone for your contributions. It's been a really interesting debate, I thought. And thanks as well for staff for all the hard work over many, many months on this and more to come. So I think it's been really good, really valuable. Yeah, look, I just also want to thank everyone that's been in touch with me in the last 24 hours. I've been flooded with emails and messages and calls from concerned West Aucklanders, and to be honest, I share some of their concerns. But, you know, I will be supporting it today. Just want to highlight a few things on the way out, I suppose. You know, I talk about this all the time around this table, but I think this is yet another example of how planning has let down this city over many decades. When we've pushed out poorer communities that cannot live near where they work or where their tertiary opportunities are, and working in outer suburban Auckland, living in outer suburban Auckland, it's the only places they can afford. And to an extent, this is why we're having some of these concerns today, is because we do want to help people that desperately need the help. You know, we're concerned about how this is going to impact those communities. I totally get that. So what I would suggest is that collection of the funds from congestion charging should closely align to where it's being collected from. Where those communities are paying the charge, they should see the benefits clearly from that charge. They should be provided with the bus routes to get around and the cycle routes to get around, the alternative options that allow them to avoid the charge if they can all possibly help it. Right? That's fair, that's equitable, and also that eventually produces a world-class city with great public transport and great cycle lanes and all the rest of it. That's what we all want, right? You know, because a lot of people have contacted me about the busway in particular, and the interim busway that, you know, I think it is a huge improvement for our community, don't get me wrong. I'm positive about it, feel positive about it, but it's not a busway. Like, it's not a full proper busway. People are still being let off on off-ramps and awkwardly crammed into shelters that are just tacked onto the side of a motorway after going down a painted lane that used to be an emergency lane, right? That's not enough. And people have sent me here to argue for proper investment, right? And I'm not going to shy away from that. I'm not going to wear claims that I shouldn't be talking about those kind of things. That's exactly why people voted me in, was to argue for these kind of things. And with this regime, this is the kind of solution that we need to get to as quickly as possible, to give people those options. Because to support it, I've got to justify it, in my opinion, to suburban communities in Auckland, and not just in my ward, but across Auckland, right? They need to know where the investment is going from when they're paying their time of use charge. That's got to be really visible to them. And if we're going to use it just to backfill lost revenue from a regional fuel tax, I'd be concerned that that's not targeted appropriately. You know, some of that RFT work, you know, fair enough, is going to places that are not taking the growth, that are not necessarily the poorest communities in our city, you know. And so we need to maybe relook at some of this stuff. We need to relook at where we're spending that money if we're going to be collecting it through this process. The other thing is, when we're around this table, I get, every time there's a budget crisis, which seems to be constant, we get people coming to us saying, we've got to cut this and that bus route. And it talks about ghost buses, talks about what happens, we should cut this and that. All the time we're talking about cutting bus routes. We can't talk about that anymore. We pass this kind of stuff. We need to provide alternatives for people to avoid this charge. And that means keeping the bus routes we have. It also means expanding the bus routes we have and the provision that we have, right? So I don't want to hear about ghost buses anymore. We don't want to talk about that anymore. And in fact, we're going to talk about being positive. We're going to talk about being ambitious for our city. We're going to talk about other cities that we might have been to in our lives that we've had fantastic public transport provision. How can we imitate them and make it like Auckland, right? How can Auckland be like these cities? There is an upside here. The upside is that we need to do stuff about our carbon emissions. We need to sort out our air quality in the city, which is a silent killer in this city, right? There are clear economic and social benefits that come with projected 10% cuts in traffic congestion. But I hope this is a ticket for us to actually grow up as a city, to actually invest in our public provision. You know, if we're doing exemption regimes that don't penalise poor communities or poor families, that don't penalise disabled families, you know, if we can do those workarounds, then I think this could work, right? So I will be supporting it today, but I'm very, very interested in what the public have to say and what the feedback process will give us. So I'm kind of reserving my judgment a little bit until we get more detail. But, you know, that's the kind of conversation I think we should be having. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. I don't think you'll be the only one that'll be doing that. And we go to Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. And I only have 2 points that I'd like to make. I will be supporting this today. The 2 points are, one is following Councillor Henderson, who's a hard act to follow. And that is around equity, but not so much around the charging of it. It's been well covered this afternoon. It's around the equity of choice, which Shane just sort of touched on in his debate. So we're going to have to make sure that from this moment forward, every decision we make is going to be to support the introduction of this charge, which means continuing to support the provision of choice in bus routes. It means not using the climate action targeted rate to fund existing work, business as usual, because part of that climate action targeted rate is putting on 10 new frequent traveller networks across the city, and one of them in Clendon, where I come from, and where people need to have the choice to take public transport because 28% of their household into running a car, it's unaffordable. So the decisions we make in the long-term plan need to support the provision of choice for people in terms of where they travel, and that includes ferries as well as buses. The second point I'd like to make, and this one is somewhat out of your hands, Chair, but when we've been speaking this afternoon, there's been references to ensuring that the voices of minority groups and women are part of the discussion, and there's going to be some good consultation on this, you know. But when I look again, and this is out of your hands because you've used the model, which is we're going to take the leadership of council to form these political working groups. The leadership just happens to be made up majority of men. You've got two good women on there, Councillor Simpson and Councillor Fletcher. But we need to get more equity in that space as well. And I know that you will represent the voices from the south and from the west as well. There is a difference, I believe, and you'll know when you're working alongside people in your community that are the most vulnerable in the city. It is different than being able to speak from a different position of being informed simply because you might live close to that area. You've actually got to be in there working alongside them. So those are my 2 points. It's about the equity and representation in a political working group, and it is about the equity and the provision of choice in public transport for the areas outside of the city where public transport works extraordinarily well and will work even better once the CRL is open, and we'll all benefit from that. Those are what I'd like us to keep in mind as we progress through. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton, and I'm just going to take my speaking turn now, and the first thing I'd say has been some really good contributions from all around the table today that really go to this measure. There's a few other people to come after me, Councillor Walker, and all I wanted to say very quickly is that in some parts of Auckland there might not be a charge, but the behaviour change associated with this time of use charging is already happening. So up where we live, every year for some time now, with the disruptor of COVID aside, people are changing their travel patterns. They're having to leave earlier and earlier to get into work. So you've got people now, the roads out, it's busy at 5:30. You know, 5 years ago it was 6:30. So people are already doing that, and as Councillor Walker said, that time of congestion actually is spreading out. So coming for meetings at 10 o'clock, the Northern Motorway can be still really packed and congested. So, there is a practical element to this as to what time you are actually going to have to travel to avoid congestion and to avoid the charge. But very simply, the only point I wanted to make about this, and it was really brought up by Councillor Philippina, was, and it's referenced in our report, point 10, to the previous resolution that was passed back in May 2024, because for me this sums up the whole basis of my support. And the wording, I thought, in that resolution back in 2021 was very good, and it was. And this went to congestion pricing, which, in effect, this is a version of what we're dealing with today. Support on principle congestion pricing in Auckland, conditional upon the following issues being addressed. 1, equity impacts. 2, public transport services and projects in place across Auckland on an equitable basis. So I'm assuming that doesn't include withdrawing public transport services that are already in place, or canning ones that were planned. That's what that statement says. 3, the revenue collected, in addition to that, needed to operate the scheme and address 1 and 2, as revenue and costs allow, replace the regional fuel tax. So that was part of the selling point to the public. It wasn't both. This would come in, that would go out, not a doubling up. And that was then reinforced later in those resolutions, where again we had the reference to the need to ensure appropriate public and active transport alternatives are in place in affected corridors. So obviously for any councillor whose ward is affected by that, those conditions have to be met. And then the final one, which I think a number of people have alluded to here, are the ongoing dialogue with Aucklanders. So this does not fly if you're not bringing people along with you, if it's not seen as fair, if it doesn't address those preconditions, it doesn't fly with the community. So I think the last thing people should be expecting is the notion we'll just be chucking in our $5 charges starting next week. No, no, no. All these things are on paper by virtue of council resolution. I'd be pretty confident that there are expectations of most people sitting around this table, and it will be up to that reference group in conjunction, as Councillor Dalton was saying, with any number of interested parties here, not just councillors or local boards, to make sure all those conditions are met, because that's the basis on which we're advancing all manner of policies and all manner of consultations with our community. Thank you.
Great to follow on from you, Mr. Chair. Sterling speech. I indicated in my questions I've got very real reservations around what's proposed here, and I'll quote from the National Council of Women Auckland. Do not reflect any in-depth understanding and modelling of the lives of real people. And I believe that to be the case in what I've seen to date. And later, do not currently perceive public transport as a safe, affordable and accessible option to car usage. I stand by that. That is the state of Auckland now, and I would suggest for some time into the future. It really disturbs me that we are proposing something that is effectively a penalty. It's a tax. It's something that people are going to have to pay, in addition to existing tolls, for example, going north, Penlink and other locations, when we have not adequately explored incentives. If you want to change people's behaviour, fundamentally, penalties don't work too well, but incentives do. Our mayor referred to what amounts to an incentive to change the trucks going to the port. It's not a penalty. They've got a charge, they're putting a charge up, but they're offering a discount so that the trucks that go to the port out of hours find it cheaper. Incentives work. I raised a range of them with Auckland Transport, but I very much doubt that too many businesses in the central city area have actually got travel plans. I don't know how many they have. I doubt very much whether Auckland Transport knows that, is just guessing that. Yet some of these large employers are more than able to offer incentives to the people that work for them to change their travel patterns, particularly those that are in the higher paid jobs. I don't see enough emphasis around incentives to encourage people to car share, to do a whole range of things. We prefer to use penalties. Incentives should come first. The other issue that concerns me is that I believe on the basis of a penalty-based scheme, that people will choose to take other routes that will generate congestion. So we will see congestion on other streets, and that people will simply choose not to use perhaps the current peak time, but will just extend the peak. And Auckland Transport knows that there's something called induced traffic. That is, if the roads are freer, then people will choose to use those roads. And there's a very complete body of study that Auckland Transport knows about that. So I see that there are absolutely fundamental flaws in this scheme. It's going to be hugely costly. I question the money that we are spending on it, against a background where the government knows, and it's the government that will very much determine things, that they will in the not too distant future have to bring in a scheme to charge cars per kilometre travelled, because hopefully as many cars as possible to meet our emissions, which are literally falling off a cliff, will need to be electric cars. So the government has to bring in a scheme which frankly will supersede this. It will supersede this. Yet we will have expended an enormous amount of money in the interim to come up with something that frankly I regard as half-baked, based on the lack of alternatives and so on. So I have very real issues around this, very real concerns. I do not think it's workable as it stands, and I do not think that we, and in particular Auckland Transport, have done anywhere enough to incentivise changes in behaviour to make better use of our roads, the vehicles that travel on those roads that could carry many more people, and these are the private cars. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Walker, and we just now have Councillor Philippina and Councillor Hills to round us off.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I just wanted to acknowledge the staff, all the work that they have done to bring this to your agenda. Also, I just want to acknowledge all the previous speakers, and in particular yourself, Chair, because there was an issue when I read the agenda, but also remember that it wasn't going to be alongside the congestion charging and the regional fuel tax. That's why I voted for the regional fuel tax, and then if congestion charging came in, I would gladly have voted that the regional fuel tax is gone as a result. I just want to acknowledge Councillor Henderson, because he has said what I wanted to say, and that is where is the representation from South Auckland, West Auckland, and those areas across Tāmaki that will be disproportionately affected if this comes in. So I just want to acknowledge Councillor Henderson for that, because like himself and many others around that table, Chair, I've been contacted quite a few times over the last sort of 24 hours. Councillor Ferry, I acknowledge the organisations that you mentioned that should be a critical part of the consultation. And so thank you for that. It'll just save me rattling off, not that you rattled, but mention all the ones that you have said. Chair, the last of my comments is that words matter. And this is why I'm getting inundated, like Councillor Henderson and the rest of us around the table. Words do matter. Now, the words that come to mind is implementation. That's the first one. So whoever was responsible for removing implementation, thank you, because people were telling me, look, you're going to do it anyway because it's going to be implemented. And I said, no, what's going to be put in place is how we're going to end up doing it. Second one is consultation, and it's been said that consultation is going to be a key to this. Equity, Chair, you've mentioned it. All the other councillors have mentioned it as well. For me, it is definitely, Councillor Josephine mentioned the statistics when one of the staff mentioned that it won't affect those that from the west and south, but I know my community, along with Councillor Fully, and it will have an effect. The other one is choice, and some of the people in the areas that have been mentioned don't have a choice in regards to the times that they start and finish work. And the last word for me is evidence. What we will be getting back is evidence in regards to making an informed decision. So I look forward to that. That's why I will be supporting it at this stage, and I look forward to the evidence and more reports back to us, Chair, and just want to again acknowledge yourself. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Councillor Filipaina. And a final speaker, Councillor Hills.
Kia ora, Chair. Thank you. I wasn't going to speak, but some of the contributions I felt like I needed to as well. I do get a little concerned when people who have been around the table a long time or in various roles seem to yell into the ether like it's someone else's fault or someone else has done or hasn't done certain things. If you aren't going to vote for the incentives and you're not going to vote for the disincentives, then you're not really voting for anything. The issue around government, Simeon Brown said 2 months ago that congestion charging will help manage demand, and they are going to work quickly with councils to enact this new change. They'd be legislating, quote, pretty rapidly. He said the government's already drafted legislation, we'll be consulting with councils, and then it will go through the normal process of consultation. We'll put submissions in, the community will have a say, like on any legislation. He also said congestion charging is a tool which will help drive change of behaviour, and we're committing significant investment into public transport, which I hope we do see. I guess for me, yes, I'm worried a lot about equity. We spoke about this last time, but it is about, at the moment, and I think my comments last time we discussed this, are about we set people up for wasting money out of their tailpipe, wasting time without their families, sitting in congestion. And yes, we have the climate action targeted rate, which some people don't like, but it is will improve 78 services around the city and bring 10 new rapid routes around the city, which will help people get around. But if there is funding for walking and cycling, that would also be great. That will help situations in different communities. But what most of the studies say is that if you remove the congestion or reduce it, you could save 20 to 40% on your petrol costs per week, which for most cases would probably be more expensive than the charge here. So those things would need to be ironed out. We don't want to leave people without choices, but this could help people make those choices. It will help business maybe deliver earlier or later if they see that as a large cost. It could help people carpool more. It could help people use public transport more if there are options for them, which then frees up the road and the time for everyone else. But what I would say, I'd say if there was a way to use this funding well, would to be help subsidise areas like Papakura or like Henderson or like Franklin, because actually on some of those areas when you're paying $5.80, $7.20 or more to travel into the city on public transport, it's not a big incentive to get public transport. Actually paying the toll plus your petrol, I guess, is going to be less expensive than the public transport. So maybe that would be something to do to try and even out those transport fares. On the shore, I pay $4.20 to get to the city in the morning, so a $3.50 charge would actually be less. So it would, you need to look at how that all balances out. But I think some of the issue is that the discrepancies in our public transport system now need to be addressed, and maybe the funding from this helps that, but that will be ironed out. But once again, if we just leave this another 10 years, we do not have the money for the transport improvements that we need urgently. We're just leaving everyone stuck in traffic. So hopefully people will jump on board and understand this more, submit, and we'll focus on those equity improvements, which there are really good examples overseas that can be based on your income, can be based on different circumstances, which will help people hopefully have more time and more money and improve those emissions that we need to do as well as a city and as a country. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hills. So it's been moved and seconded.
We take a division, please.
Division. Calling for a division.
would you consider taking any of those items separately, particularly A?
Yes, certainly. I'm happy to do that. I think Councillor Turner asked for that. So we'll take A by division and then the balance by division too, if that's what people are calling for.
Mr. Chairman, in order that we can find some consensus on this, I'm the seconder and the Mayor's not here at the moment, but I don't believe he would oppose this. The concerns that were raised by Councillor Turner, instead of endorsing time of use, indicative work,
Sorry, we've
progress.
finished the debate. Can't change the motions now.
Yeah. Yes, we're at the point of voting now. So I think people have asked. I'm happy to take it. But
I was waiting for the Mayor's return,
Yeah.
and I'm sorry that we need to be so rigid on this, because it just strikes me as an issue that we should all come together
yeah.
on.
Okay. So having said that, could we proceed to A? So we're voting on A by division. Endorse the time of use charging indicative work program and the creation of a joint Auckland Transport, Auckland Council program team to progress time of use charging as soon as practical. It's like doing the eye test and the optometrist here. I'm looking at that screen right down there. Oh, jeez, there's one here. My eyesight's first, and I thought. Okay, over to you, Lata Duncan.
Councillor Baker.
For.
Councillor Bartley.
For.
Mayor Brown.
He's online.
He's
I think.
online.
Vote yes in favour.
Member Brown. Councillor Darton.
For.
Councillor Dovey.
For.
Councillor Ferry.
For.
Councillor Filipina.
Filipina, aye.
Councillor Fletcher.
Yes.
Councillor Foley.
For.
Councillor Henderson.
For.
Councillor Hills.
Aye.
Councillor Lee.
He's gone.
Councillor Leone.
For.
Councillor Newman.
Yes.
Member Renata. Councillor Sayers.
For.
Councillor Stewart.
For.
Councillor Turner.
Against.
Councillor Walker.
Against.
Councillor Williamson.
Yes.
And the Chair.
For.
That's carried.
Okay, so that A was carried, and now we go to the balance.
Chair, I meant the division on the first one.
First one?
No, on what's just been voted. That's what I was really calling the division on. So if somebody else wanted to call a division on the balance.
Is there anyone that requires a division for the balance, or can we just do it on the voices? Okay, happy to do it on the voices. So all those in favour of B through to D, say aye.
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 Against? Carried unanimously. Yes. All right, for that was a pretty lengthy item. Thank you for your patience, everyone. We're now at 4 o'clock, so we'll bring up. Oh, so we have to move an extension. Okay, moved by Councillor Baker, second by Councillor Dalton. All those in favour? Against? Okay, carried.